I'm going to ask you straight away, Scott, what you think of the general overall military situation. My own very, uninformed civilian view is that there's a major battle now happening in Donbass, or is shaping out to happen in Donbass. The Russians have said pretty much from the start of this war that was the focus of their interest. People continuously forget that the operation started, the actual grounds for starting this operation were to protect Donbass. It was done in response to a request for help from the leaders of the two Donbass republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. But I get the sense that we're moving towards a climactic battle in Donbass, and that will probably be the decisive battle of the war. I mean, is that your perspective? And then if it is, maybe we can talk about what happened in Kiev and what's happening in other places.
No, you're 100% correct. I always try to listen to what the principal parties say when trying to assess what they're doing. And there's an awful lot of people out there today who talk about Putin's playbook, the Russian playbook, as if they have a copy of it right next to them and they can flip over to page 63 and tell me exactly what's transpiring. Nobody has a copy of it except Putin and the Russian general staff, and they're not sharing it. To the extent that they do provide insight, we would do well to listen to them. For instance, in Putin's lengthy address justifying his decision to launch this special military operation, he was quite clear that this was done for the sole purpose of freeing Donbass, Lugansk, Donetsk from Ukrainian occupation, to return the totality of the territories of these two newly independent entities to their sovereign governments. But he said, if we limited it simply to this operation, there's a huge mass of Ukrainian troops that Russia believed was getting ready to attack the Donbass, and that if you didn't take them into account, then this battle will become very complicated very quickly. And you can't take them into account simply by attacking them, but you also have to understand that they are connected to the Ukrainian military as a whole. So if you limit your attack to just addressing the 60 to 100,000 Ukrainian troops that are amassed in the Donbass region, you allow the Ukrainians now operating on interior lines. That's a nice little military term, meaning that they're using their own railroads, their own roads, their own logistics system. They have their ammunition dumps already in place. And so logistically operating is very easy. And logistics is sort of the heartbeat of modern combat. If your logistics is functioning and you have well-trained troops, you're going to do pretty good in this war. And so if you just leave the Ukrainians alone, they're going to be able to bring in reinforcements. They're going to be able to bring in logistics sustainability. And they're going to disrupt your entire operation up to and including they may win because they have a larger military in the immediate vicinity than the Russians had brought to bear. So Russia had to expand the operation to nullify this Ukrainian advantage. And this, I guess, would be what's called phase one. Now, to be fair to the critics of the Russians, and Russia didn't come out and say phase one from the start. The Russians have not had a very good track record of explaining this war. And again, from a military perspective, they don't need to. You and I really don't need to know what's going on. The Russians don't care. But when your opponent is engaged in a massive information warfare operation that is done in concert with NATO members, with mainstream media, et cetera, in a very virulent social media presence, you will be on your back foot diplomatically and from public relations standpoint by ceding the information battlefield to the enemy. And the Russians pretty much have done that. So they launched an operation. It wasn't explained at all what was going on. Why did they put an airborne assault into Hostomel Field on day one? What was the purpose of that assault? What was the purpose of coming into Kiev? Were you trying to take Kiev? Were you trying to isolate Kiev? Or were you creating a diversion? They didn't explain everything. They're leaving it up to speculation. Now we come to phase two, and apparently the Russians have said, no, what we were doing was shaping the battlefield, which from a military standpoint is absolutely what you needed to do. They needed to shape the battlefield, to divert Ukrainian resources, to pin them in place, freeze them, to make sure reserves didn't go down to the east but went north, to destroy the logistics infrastructure that could sustain combat. And it appears that Russia did all of this, but we're only finding out about it after the fact. And some people are saying, well, that's just Russia, redefining their objectives because they got beat so badly in phase one. And that's one of the the narratives that's out there, that Russia has suffered if not a strategic defeat, at least an operational defeat, compelling them to redefine their operation. But the operation that they're redefining sounds an awful like what President Putin said was their original objective. They are in the process of diverting significant combat power away from Kiev, bringing it down to the Kharkov region, where they can launch an attack south from Kharkov. And they are taking the 40,000 troops that had been investing Mariupol and bringing them, and they're going to drive north. And at some point in time on the territory of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, that northern pincer and that southern pincer are going to meet, and they're going to have surrounded 60 to 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers who will be rapidly eliminated as an effective combat fighting force. And that's going to be one of the great military victories of all time if it occurs the way that it appears to be occurring. Which then, again, now we come back to the information battlefield. When you're losing, when ground truth on the field of battle does not, isn't reflected in your favor, what do you do if you're the side that's losing? You seek to divert attention away from the defeat that you're getting ready to suffer, and you create alternative narratives. And I think this weekend we saw one of those alternative narratives.
I understand that. Can I just, before we go on to that, though, again, I speak as a civilian. I mean, you talk about information war and military war, but if you're engaging in a diversion, if you're seeking to divert Ukrainian troops by concentrating them in Kiev, do you tell them that's what you're doing? I mean, isn't it, if you're going to follow an operational plan, don't you try and keep it secret to some extent? I mean, maybe I'm, maybe from quite like that in full, but still.
Again, assuming that the Russian narrative is correct, that this was in fact a diversion, I believe it will be studied as one of the greatest diversions in modern military history, because with a force of between 40 and 50,000 troops, which, by the way, is not capable of taking a city of 3.1 million. The Russians held in place significant Ukrainian military resources and captured the attention of the world. If you think about it, the mere act of putting trucks on a road that extended for 40 miles paralyzed Ukraine and the world. Every waking moment, people were looking at those trucks going, what are they doing? What are those trucks doing? Why do they have the trucks on the road? I mean, are they going to attack Kiev? The Russians didn't have to do anything except keep the trucks there. And the diversion was complete, because that's all everybody focused on was the trucks. Meanwhile, while the Ukrainian government's, again, reserves that are in Western Ukraine that should have been sent while they could be sent, while the rail network is working, while you have fuel, could have been sent to the eastern concentration of forces to reinforce the flanks, making any eventual pincer all but impossible, had to go to Kiev or had to go down to Odessa. If you remember, big battles near Mykolaiv coming out of Kherson, big battles. And again, the Ukrainians rushed down to reinforce. So the reserves are now depleted. They're gone. There's no more reserves. They've been committed to Kiev. They've been committed to Odessa. Meanwhile, the main objective for the Russians is sitting there like a ripe apple waiting to be plucked. So yeah, you're right. I mean, the Russians don't need to come out and say this is nothing but a grand diversion. No, they could have said, however, that this is that they have an objective on Kiev. But again, they didn't need to. I mean, again, you and I would like to have them better define what they're doing. But from their perspective, the less said, the better, because the uncertainty that is derived from a lack of information from the Russian side feeds speculation, feeds this, the Western propaganda machine wondering what in the hell. Actually, I don't know if I could say that. What in the heck are the Russians up to? And like I said, at some point in time, this war is going to end. At some point in time, the truth is going to come out. Documents are going to be provided, and I believe that we're going to see one of the great pincer envelopments in modern times. But the thing that made the pincer possible was this diversion, the Kiev diversion, which, if it is what I think it is and what it appears to be, was masterful. Now, some people say that it was a bridge too far, that this was a repeat of, Arnhem back in 1944, that the Russians were going for the coup d'état to send these elite paratroopers into Hostomel, that they were going to reinforce them with the 73rd Air Landing Brigade that was going to make a bold thrust into a city of 3.1 million, defended by over 100,000 people, and somehow capture the government in Kiev and change. That's a wonderful story, but I don't think you'll find a single military professional that'll tell you that was possible. And I know one thing about the Russians: they are professional. They're not perfect. We've seen video proof that they're not perfect, but they are professional. And I just can't imagine a situation where they would say, we're going to send, an elite airborne regiment into Kiev to be slaughtered in the streets like sheep. The Russians learned this lesson once in Grozny, early on in the Chechen conflict, when they dispatched, armored regiments into the Chechen capital, only to have them cut off and slaughtered. I don't see this modern day iteration of the Russian military making that same mistake in Kiev. So I view this as a masterful deception that will be studied by military historians for years to come. As
let's talk about what's going on in and around Kiev at the moment, because of course this is the other thing. I mean, again, following the media coverage of the war up to now, it has been overwhelmingly focused. I'm talking about the media coverage on what's been going on around Kiev. So we've been learning all about little battles. I mean, as far as I can see, fairly small scale battles, places like Irpin and Bucha and wherever. Now the Russians pulled out. I read the British newspapers telling us how the Ukrainians drove the Russians back. There was a liberation, that they won back all this territory from the Russians. And now, of course, we have all these stories about a terrible massacre perpetrated allegedly in Bucha. Do you think that, well, first of all, do you think there were any major battles? Because my impression was that it was all on a fairly minor scale. And I never got the sense that the Russians were ever trying to storm Kiev at any time. And I think you explained that it would have been an impractical thing to do. But it seemed to me a withdrawal by the Russians from these places, Ukraine moving its forces in. And then, of course, we have this story. I mean, what are your thoughts about it? Have you any views? I mean, why would the Russians carry out a massacre like this in this kind of place? I mean, I don't understand the logic of it at all. But have you any thoughts about this?
Well, we'll start with the military question. Yeah. I think early on, as the Russians were making their demonstration in force, that there were major battles. I think there had to be major battles because you had to convince the Ukrainians that this was a major fight. I mean, if all you're having is a series of tactical probes, the Ukrainians might not be so panicked into diverting the majority of their strategic reserves into the Kiev battlefield. So I do believe that early on we saw the Russians make some major pushes and suffered some serious tactical defeats as a result. They pushed hard, maybe too hard, and the Ukrainians were able to cut off some units, bring some artillery to bear. Because remember, this is early on in the battle. So the Russians hadn't totally shaped the battlefield yet. So the Ukrainians still had effective command and control. They still had effective fire support. Their units in the front lines would be able to call back, call in fire, etc. So, and then the Russians are doing the same. Let's not pretend for a second that the Ukrainians weren't taking horrific casualties. They were. These were big fights. But then things slowed down. I mean, it slowed down to molasses, the 40-mile convoy. And then after that, I think what we saw is that the Russian presence alone was sufficient to cause panic in Kiev and the response. And then when you have a static battlefield, and I think the Russians had made the decision that, if the idea was deception, they made their point early on with the aggressive thrust in. But now, you don't want to sacrifice troops needlessly. I mean, every soldier lost early on was lost in a strategically just decision. People can criticize the tactics all they want, but from the strategic standpoint, losing 300, 400 soldiers in order to pin down 120,000 Ukrainians is a strategic victory. But it's a horrible tactical defeat for the soldiers that got killed or wounded. But they're also slaughtering the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians don't want to talk about the number of casualties they've taken for obvious reasons, but they're horrific. But now the Ukrainians, again, because let's also understand something else. These aren't amateurs. The Ukrainian military is very well trained, very well led, very well equipped, and they're professional. And all the concepts that the Russians know of strategy and tactics and operations, the Ukrainians know as well. And so I believe the Ukrainians began to launch a series of localized counterattacks. Now, the Russians have a choice. Because when I say localized counterattack, what that means is that the Ukrainians seek to achieve military superiority in a given area on the battlefield before they launch the counterattack. And now the Russians could either stay in place and lose more men for a piece of territory that no longer has strategic importance, or they can do tactical withdrawals, tactical redeployments on the battlefield. And so that's where people started talking, well, the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back. No, the Russians were basically doing a series of tactical withdrawals. And again, if you study military history, again, World War II is a prime example of this. You study the detailed campaigns of what was going on on both the Russian side and the German side, and you'll see that the major battles were really formed by a series of minor engagements, minor probes, minor counterattacks, minor maneuvers that take place. And when you're down there looking at it, you realize you have a bunch of ants running around doing stuff. But when you pull back, all you see is a red blur. And it looks just like a static line. And there's nothing going on. But then you come back down, and them ants are going at it again. And that's the reality of the Kiev battlefield, is that from a distance, it looks static. When you look at a map, you'll see one day, you got a little bulge here, and the next day the bulge is gone. And you're like, oh, the Ukrainians, strategic counterattack. No, just a bunch of ants moving around on the battlefield, shifting up, getting in a better position. Yeah. And the Russians did that because they still needed to keep the Ukrainians frozen in place. Having created the diversion to suck the Ukrainian reserve in place, you now have to keep them frozen in place. So you have to keep this static maneuvering going on. They're not going to let the Ukrainians beat them. And so I don't think the Ukrainians quite understand what's about to happen to them, because this isn't a defeated military. The Russians haven't lost anything. They're winning this. They know they're winning this, and the war's going at pace they are determining, not Ukraine. People need to put on their thinking caps. You don't blow up major fuel depots every night and suddenly expect the Ukrainian military to be this wonderful maneuvering force.
No.
They're in tanks they can't drive. Their tanks are static right now because there's no fuel in the tank, which means that once you get into a battle of maneuver, coffin. It's a coffin.
Yeah.
Same thing with their armored vehicles. The same thing with their artillery. Where's the ammunition coming from? You know, you see all those multiple rocket launchers going off, woo, 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 and it's really dramatic and everything. But now you got to reload. Where's that stuff coming from? You need 90 trucks worth of ammo to come up and get the battalion ready. There ain't 90 trucks because even if they have the trucks, they don't have the fuel for the trucks. And they don't have the ammo anymore because it was blown up in the ammo dump. So Ukrainians have exhausted their ability to fight. That's why right now we have a major propaganda effort underway to keep the attention of the West in place. Because believe me, the West knows what's going on. You don't think NATO intelligence understands the reality on the ground in Ukraine? They know the Ukrainian army has been defeated. They know it's over. There's nothing. Yet the Ukrainians are saying, feed me, feed me, feed me, feed me. Now, it'd be one thing if you looked at them and said, yeah, no, you're not going to get it. Yeah, you've lost. But then they create diversions, and I'm sure we're going to talk about one of these diversions pretty soon, that enrages the West. And
yes.
Now what is it? In addition to saying the bad Russians are evil, it's we have to give the Ukrainians everything they're asking for so they can continue this fight. I mean, how pathetic is it that you don't acknowledge if you're going to sit there and talk about sending, I don't know, was it 50 to 70 T-72 tanks you're talking about sending in? When Ukraine had 2,000 of them, they're all gone.
Yeah.
They're all gone. There's one or two around, but they've been destroyed, annihilated. There's nothing left. They're talking about sending in, old, Soviet era East German infantry fighting vehicles that have been reconverted by the Czechs on behalf of the Swedes who no longer want them. They want to sell them. Who knows what's going on? But why do they need those? Because they got nothing left. And so you honestly think that you're going to bring in 70 tanks, 150 infantry fighting vehicles, even if you can get the crews to operate them. Those crews haven't trained with each other. They don't have effective command and control. They don't have fuel. And they're now going to go to the battle. Let's say you filled up the tanks. One last parting gift from the West. We filled up the tanks so you can go to the battlefield. They're all going to die before they get there because the Russians are going to bomb them. I mean, this is the reality of the military thing, but the propaganda war is so intense that the West is going to continue to feed in these weapons, and all it's doing is prolonging the suffering of the Ukrainian people and guaranteeing that an even larger percentage of the Ukrainian army is going to die on the field of battle. There shouldn't be a need for one more Ukrainian soldier to die. They've proven their courage. They've proven they know how to fight, but they've lost. And now all we're doing is guaranteeing that A, Ukrainian soldiers are going to die, but B, too, look at the Russians. They said up front, we don't want to harm your civilian infrastructure. But the longer this war goes on, the more Russia has to target the civilian infrastructure. That's why, if this was the United States, do you really think that the refinery that the Russians hit the other night, Kermonton or whatever, would have lasted nearly a month into the war? No, it would have been blown up on day one. Do you think that the train network that has allowed Ukrainian refugees to flee from Kharkiv and eastern Ukraine to Lvov and to Poland, that train network would have been left intact? Nope, would have been blown up on day one. You think there'd be a bridge in Ukraine today standing? No, they would have all blown. That's what we do. That's what I did. I mean, I looked at a target and we looked at the strategic, importance of everything, and we killed it all. We blew it all up. You want military industry? It was all blown up. Civil industry, we call that dual capable, by the way, because if you can produce a car, you can produce a tank, so we blow that up too. We would have taken it all out. The Russians didn't do this. They didn't do this until now. So the longer this war goes on, the more Russia is going to be compelled to destroy that which Ukraine will need to reconstitute itself once this war is over. And the blame is solely on the Ukrainian government. Solely on the Ukrainian government. Not because I'm justifying the Russian incursion, but because we have to deal with reality. We have to deal with the reality as it exists today, and Ukraine cannot win this war. There's not a rational, sane person that can articulate a case for Ukraine winning this war. Therefore, everything that transpires from this moment on is nothing more than an act of futility. on the part of the Ukrainian government. And it's the Ukrainian civilians that are going to pay the price, not just now, but decades from now, because their country is gone. It's finished, it's destroyed. Not at war with the Ukrainian civilians. That calculus may have changed, but going in, we are not at war with Ukrainian civilians. And so every soldier was briefed on how you're going to treat the Ukrainian civilians with respect and how you're going to minimize damage to civilian infrastructure. And we know this because that's what we saw in the first weeks of the war. We saw the Russians come in very soft. Even the Ukrainians admit it. Talk to the Ukrainians. The soldiers came in, they were very polite. The soldiers, the mayor, I was briefed that I could retain control, but I needed to make sure there, we weren't hiding guns and stuff like that. But once they searched for weapons, I was in control of the town. I was told to keep doing my job. The civilians were told to keep living their lives. So in that, commander's intent being executed nearly flawlessly by the Russian soldier, so flawlessly that the Russian soldiers are taking casualties as a result of their soft approach, means that the Russians are an extremely well-trained, well-disciplined force. And they're obeying the orders. They understand the importance of these orders. So now they're in Bucha, up north. I think that's where we're going to here. And Bucha was a bloody battle. I mean, one only has to take a look at the videotape. You see that the airborne especially suffered great casualties in Bucha. They lost dozens of vehicles. They probably lost hundreds of men. But eventually they controlled Bucha. They controlled it for a number of weeks. The Russians have said while we were in Bucha, we treated the Ukrainian civilians with great respect. We let them continue to have their cell phones. Imagine, I just want people to think about this for a second. The cell phone is the ultimate conduit of intelligence. I mean, we've seen videotapes of Ukrainian children being arrested by the Ukrainian police because they took a photograph of something, put it on social media, and could have been used by the Russians to target, as if the Russians need 10-year-old's video to target. They don't have satellites. They don't have, but the logic doesn't matter. The point is, the first thing you would normally do in a combat operation of this thing is just jam all communications. And then anybody who has a cell phone, you seize the cell phones. And you have every right to do so, every right. But the Russians did not do that. They told them, use your cell phones. We're not interfering with your life. Live your life. And they did things like the Russians said, look, we traded our dry goods for their dairy product. So, if the soldiers wanted milk, if they wanted cheese, if they wanted cream, if they wanted eggs, there was a barter system where the Russians would bring in dry goods and get this. In fact, now, this is fine and dandy, except one thing. This war has become, even though the Russians came in claiming that the Ukrainians were their Slavic brothers, their cousins, and they wanted to respect this, they didn't want to harm. This war has become something different, especially from the Ukrainian standpoint. Ukrainians right now, the nationalists, I should say, who control some of the key police and military and governmental structures, have turned this into a war of hate, where the Russian has become a subhuman, and can, we saw there was a communication coming out of, I think, Dnipro or Dnipropetrovsk, where the mayor was saying, kill them all, kill them, they're subhumans, kill them all. And we've seen similar things, castrate Russian prisoners, so forth and so forth. So we've seen this become a visceral war of hatred, especially from the Ukrainian side, where collaborators are killed, tortured, murdered. And we know this because we've seen that in Mariupol, we've seen it elsewhere. So now the Russians are in Bucha. They've worked out an arrangement for peaceful coexistence with the population. And now they withdraw. And the first units in are the Ukrainian National Police. But they're not national police. They're the Azov Battalion, reconfigured as the national police. We know this. We know that the national police absorbed a tremendous number of right-wing nationalist neo-Nazis. And they come in And the first videotapes out of there show a town that's been destroyed. There's a few bodies around, but not many. And the mayor is bragging about how the town is totally in control. He's got control of everything. It's done. This was March 30th, the Russians left. March 31st, the Ukrainian forces come in. On April 2nd, a videotape was released. It's a little over a minute long, and it shows a dozen or so bodies littering a street. It's a horrible video. I mean, it does, it's bad, but I think I talked with Alex beforehand. It's not that bad. What I mean by that is war is hell. War is hell. I can guarantee you there's worse scenes in Ukraine than what they showed on that street. That's just the way war is. Mariupol, I think, had even scenes that were more horrific than this because of the heavy fighting. But what made these bodies different is that many of them had been bound, and it looked like they had been executed. And so now the spin that's coming out is that the Russians did this. The Russians executed. Why would an army who's made so much sacrifice in defense of the commander's intent of not harming Ukrainian civilians, of not harming Ukrainian infrastructure, at the last minute throw it all away for the sake of killing 12 people? No. You know who killed them? I believe the Ukrainian National Police came in and began a program of retribution where good Ukrainian citizens pointed out Farmer Joe, who dared sell the Russians eggs. Well, that's a death sentence now. Miss Smith, she opened up a post office that, I know, but all I'm saying is anybody who is seen as collaborating or cooperating with the Russians, especially if you're a Russian speaker, it's a death sentence. I believe some of these people were just captured and shot. Some were trying to escape and were gunned down in the process of escaping once it became clear that this retribution was taking place. And that this is 100%, well, I'm going to back it off. This is 90% the fault of the Ukrainians. But the Russians have the blame too. Not because they perpetrated the crime, but if you can't be so blind to the reality of the situation that you're in, not to understand what's going to happen to the people who cooperated with you, collaborated with you. And you needed to bring buses in and say, guys, we're leaving. And if you stay, we're afraid that you're going to die. So we need you to pack a suitcase, get in the bus, and we're going to resettle you. Maybe at some point you can come back here when things have calmed down. But right now we're afraid that if you stay, you're going to die. And give them at least the option of leaving. Now, maybe that option was given. Maybe we don't know. But obviously, the people who died weren't given that option or disregarded that option and paid the ultimate price. But there's nothing about this that makes sense. And also here, I'll leave the final thing on this one. Right now we're speculating. We're just spitballing. We could end the speculation right now. Right now, Karim Khan, the senior prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, is in Ukraine with an investigatory team. He claims that he's investigating allegations of war crimes. Well, guess what, Karim? There's 12 bodies up in Bucha right now. Before they get moved and tainted, why don't you pull them out and have a forensic autopsy performed on them? Because when you do, you're going to find out time of death to near certainty. And I can guarantee you that the time of death isn't going to be March 30th, anywhere near March 30th. It's probably going to be close to April 1st, April 2nd, which tells you mechanism of death. Okay, again, you're the guy. We know what units were there. There's a videotape where the Ukrainian National Policeman asks his boss, hey, they're not wearing the blue band. Can I shoot them? And he gives an expletive. Yeah, hell yeah, shoot them. And they shot him. They killed him. So mechanism of death. Where were they shot? Back of the head, back of the back, front. What killed them? Was there sign of torture? Was there, had the bodies been moved? Did they die where they were at? Or had they been moved? I mean, normally when you're shot and you bleed out, there's going to be a big puddle of blood. But if you got a body on the ground and you flip it over and there ain't no blood, it tells me they were died somewhere else and brought here. These are things that a forensic investigation would show. And that forensic investigation can happen Right now, they're there and they're not doing anything.
Yeah.
Why? Because the Ukrainian government doesn't want the truth.
Yeah.
Because if the truth comes out, you don't get all this wild speculation. You don't get the whole world foaming at the mouth. You don't get the Pope condemning the Russians. We have, Zelensky able to give live video conferences to U.S. Congress, to the British Parliament. So again, and if you think about it, that's only to Ukraine's benefit. I mean, literally every time Zelensky spoke, hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment came flowing his direction. And you have to sit there and go, what is Russia up to? Why are you doing this? Because they want it to happen. Because they don't care about the equipment. What it appears to me that what they're doing is playing a masterful game of taking a failed president who is at 23% and dropping, a man who was totally compromised by selling out to the neo-Nazis, a man who was reduced to arresting his political opposition and shutting down his opposition media, who in no way could be sold to anybody as a democratic leader of any stature. So if you shut everything down at the beginning, that's who Zelensky is, failed president. So now if you want to get him to surrender, people are going to kill him if they're Azov, or ignore him if they're the West. They're going to create a government in exile that will speak on behalf of anybody because Zelensky is useless. So the Russians have said, no. We need Zelensky to certify the terms of surrender. But in order to do that, we have to allow the West to turn him into Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, whatever we want to call this failed comedian. He's now going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. So let him communicate. Let everything happen. Leave the train running without hindrance so idiots from Europe can come and visit him in Kiev if they want to. We're going to turn this guy into the greatest thing in the world. So when he speaks, the world listens and the world acts. And then when the time comes and he signs the surrender documents, the world has to say, he's the legitimate leader of Ukraine and we have to respect his wishes. So that's, I see a lot of that going on as well.
Well, what about the insurgency issue?
Oh, the insurgency.
I mean, do you think there's any? Yeah.
Man, the Russians have a very, very, very good domestic policing capability. I'm not proud of that as a pro-democracy person, because I think that that ability is used oftentimes to shut down legitimate dissent. But the Russians are masters at monitoring the communications of dissenting voices. And an insurgency is the ultimate form of a dissenting voice. It's taking the weaponization of words and turning it into actual violence. Now, the insurgency can come from two sources. Three, I would say. First one is pre-planned insurgency. And we saw evidence that at least the West was claiming that it was creating this capability. When you had media reports come out of that Barack Obama back in 2015 authorized the CIA Special Activities Division to carry out a covert program of training select Ukrainian intelligence and special operations and military personnel for stay-behind operations in unconventional warfare, up to and including on Russian soil. And these people were taken out of Ukraine to the United States, taken down to a undisclosed training facility in the southern United States, where they crawled around and learned how to kill and all this stuff. And then they were sent back to wait for their moment in time. Problem with this story is, if we know about it, it ain't secret. There's just nothing secret about it. We're talking about it. You and I are talking about it right now, and we're not just making it up. We're not speculating. There's a story that cites 5 former CIA officials in a position to know. Now, when I was in the intelligence business, human intelligence and covert action of this nature was some of the most highly protected intelligence imaginable. Why? Because if it's compromised, lives get lost. It's not just like compromising $1 billion satellite. That's just money. But compromising a program like this, lives will be lost. So it's highly classified information that will never be declassified to the point that it can be released to the public, ever. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that the 25-year mandatory declassification laws that exist, this is the stuff that falls into that exception that says this will never be discussed. If this was a real program, those documents will be hidden in the vault of the CIA for over 100 years before somebody finally writes about it. That's just fact. So why are 5 CIA people committing treason? Because that's what they're committing. It's not just espionage, they're committing treason. And I also have to say that the number of people that would be in the know of this program is limited. So now we have 5. I can guarantee you that any concerted counterintelligence investigation would identify some of those 5, track them down, and get them to confess before they go to jail for the rest of their lives. Because the alternative is the electric chair, because you committed treason. But nothing's happening, which tells you that this is just BS. It's garbage. This is a propaganda ploy. This is to create perception of an insurgency capability so that Russia diverts resources to hunt shadows, to hunt phantoms, to hunt ghosts. So there's that. I don't think that's real because I don't think 5 CIA people would have. And again, the people I know in the CIA, I may disagree with their conclusions. I may disagree with their tactics. I may disagree with just about everything, but I will never doubt their patriotism. These are some of the most patriotic people imaginable. They love their country. They don't, this is why when a CIA officer defects or is caught spying, it's such a heavy blow, because the CIA, is an organization that prides itself in having some of the most loyal people working for it, people who are assiduous about obeying rules regarding classification and information security. So suddenly that 5 senior CIA people disregard all that, throw it away so they can get a newspaper article that does nothing more than expose a top secret covert action program, the exposure of which will probably cost people their lives. No, it doesn't pass the smell test. The next thing is the military aspect of it. What I mean by that is you have highly trained military personnel who are going to be defeated in battle, and they can't carry out the conventional resistance. So they melt into the woods and they become modern day partisans. And this could be especially true with people like airborne forces or special forces who are trained in that kind of irregular conflict. And there's no doubt in my mind that this will happen, that there will be those amongst the Ukrainians who will refuse to surrender when the time comes, who will insist on carrying the fight. They won't respect the decision made by the top, and they'll continue to fight. And they will fight effectively. They will kill hundreds of Russians, and then they will all die, because that's what happens when you're an isolated insurgency force in the middle of a forest that's going to be surrounded by Russians, and they're going to come in and kill you all. If you try and embed yourself in a urban area, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to sustain meaningful resistance, especially with a police force that is as effective as the Russians are. And now we come up to the third one, which is the citizens' revolt. All these well-armed citizens with their Molotov cocktails and stuff. They are the personification of amateurs. Amateurs never live. They always die because they don't know what they're doing. They're not trained. They don't know how to do covert communication. They don't know how to do deception. They don't know anything. They're just going to go out there and think they can throw a bottle full of jellied gasoline with a rag that's been lit on fire at a tank, and that's wonderful. And they may hit the tank, but then they're going to die. And everybody involved, they'll just get rounded up and they'll get slaughtered. So now I come to the conclusion: there will be no viable insurgency against Russia.
Have you any idea how this war ends? We have the destruction of the Ukrainian army in Donbass. By the way, I'm sure you're right. I can't see any other outcome there than to see that army destroyed. What happens then? Do we have a negotiation? Do we have a peace settlement? What if Zelensky doesn't negotiate? What if he continues to take the very hard line that the British, for example, are urging him to, and resistance continues? Do the Russians move west? Do they go to Lviv? Do they stay east of the Dniester? How do you see this war ending eventually?
Well, we have to examine, to answer that question, you got to look at it from the four corners of the conflict itself, but then you have to put it into the context in which this conflict was initiated, because you can't ignore that. And then you also have to take into account the consequences of the conflict, because you can't ignore that either. So the first thing is, Russia has set forth two military objectives and one political objective. Two political. The first political objective, of course, is the return of sovereign control of Donetsk and Lugansk to the newly independent states of Donetsk and Lugansk. Another one is recognition by Crimea of Ukraine of the Russian control of Crimea. But these are side things. The big political objective is Ukrainian neutrality. That's ultimately why this war was fought, to achieve Ukrainian neutrality. And to do that, you need two things. You need denazification and demilitarization. Demilitarization is simply, it was initially just deconstructing the NATO architecture that existed in the Ukrainian military, that the Ukrainian military could stay intact, but it would just basically the NATO infrastructure would be taken down. The Ukrainian military has decided to fight, so I think now demilitarization means literally there will be no more Ukrainian military. If something's going to exist down the road, it'll be built from the ground up. But do svidaniya, Ukrainian armed forces. Your day is over. And so the war doesn't end until they're destroyed. I think that's just clear, because you can't leave them. The history says so. All we have to do is take a look at World War I and what happened to the German army that was fighting in France when the surrender came in. They didn't believe they were defeated. They called it the stab in the back, and they withdrew back to Germany. And you created the conditions for World War II. I mean, it just led to the revival of German militarism. If you don't destroy the Ukrainian military, all you're doing is creating the conditions for the revival of Ukrainian militarism. And then you have to marry that with the other thing, denazification. And denazification isn't just about killing every member of the Azov battalion or every other national military formation. It is delegitimizing the ideology of the right sector of the nationalist parties, of making sure that the odious ideology of Stepan Bandera is no longer mainstreamed. So it's about passing laws that ban this. It's about the physical dismemberment of political parties and the arrest and holding to account political leaders who impose this ideology on Ukraine, therefore providing ideological impetus for Azov to commit the crimes they are committing. That's denazification. Why do I believe that's that? Because the Russians know denazification. They've denazified before. They understand what's needed. It's not just about getting rid of the Waffen-SS. It's about pulling every single Nazi bureaucrat out into court and then hanging them by the neck until dead if they're found guilty of promoting this kind of conflict. So I don't believe Russia can accomplish that without going west. I don't think this war ends until Lvov has been dismembered. And so this could be a longer conflict than anybody thinks. I could be wrong. Maybe Russia wants to do all this, but maybe they don't have the ability to. Maybe they're after they close the pincers, they won't. But I think when they close the pincers, you're going to see a new reality. Remember, there are no strategic reserves left in Ukraine. They were all sucked up into Kiev, and they're staying in Kiev right now. They've tried to move some brigades down, and they're getting destroyed. They move out of Kiev. They get on the railroads, and they get blown up. They're losing everything. Anything that moves from Kiev to the east is killed. So the Russians, when they close this gap, and when you have 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers paraded through the streets of Mariupol with their hands on their heads, in a repeat of what they did to the Nazis in 1943 through Moscow, the Russian military is now going to be moving into a giant vacuum because there's nothing left. And as they move towards Lvov, the resistance won't be what anybody thinks. It's going to be over that quick. You're going to see people fleeing to Poland, the nationalists especially. In fact, so Ukraine isn't just what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine is what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the world, what's happening in Russia. And that's why I say anybody who thinks that Russia is simply going to stop this operation and negotiate itself into defeat, into a position of weakness, doesn't understand the big picture, because this is so much more than just Ukraine. This is about the future of European security. If Russia surrenders in the negotiating table, they have no leverage when they talk about the future of European security. If Russia surrenders in the negotiating table, Putin loses all the political advantage he's gained by having the West orchestrate this defeat, this divorce. And if he surrenders on the negotiating table, the great transition to a trans-Eurasian economic future of multipolarity is over. So I don't see the Russians negotiating anything away. I see them basically, they're going to confront Zelensky with an awful reality, and Zelensky's going to have to decide how he's going to deal with that reality. It may cost Zelensky his life.